Welcome to Shadowed Story. Hit the subscribe button and join the Shadowed Story family. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. The road had been long, and the night was swallowing everything around me. The headlights of my car sliced through the darkness, casting fleeting beams across empty stretches of dirt road. A cool wind howled through the trees, the branches twisting in unnatural patterns, as though the forest itself was alive, watching me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white against the worn leather. The map I had pulled up on my phone showed nothing but a blinking dot, lost in a sea of gray nothingness. The cabin I'd rented was somewhere ahead, a small, secluded refuge promised to be peaceful, isolated, a place to unwind. But as the distance between me and civilization grew, a feeling gnawed at the pit of my stomach, a quiet, creeping unease. When the road finally curved and a small, weathered sign appeared, its letters barely legible, I slowed the car down, squinting to read it. Hollow Creek. That was the place. It seemed like the kind of name meant to sound quaint, but tonight, in the shadows of the forest, it felt like an omen. I turned off the engine, the silence that followed almost suffocating in its heaviness. I had arrived. The cabin was tucked away in a clearing surrounded by thick woods. There were no neighbors, no sounds of life save for the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The exterior was old, wooden, weather-beaten, but the porch light flickered on as I approached. I stepped out of the car and inhaled the fresh, crisp air. It wasn't a bad place, but there was a weight to it, a heaviness that didn't belong to nature. The kind of feeling you get when you enter a room and realize you're not alone, even though you can't see anyone. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just overtired from the drive. The lock on the door was stiff, and the wood groaned as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting the intrusion. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but cozy enough. A small living area with a fireplace, a few mismatched chairs, and an old-fashioned rug. The scent of pine and dust filled the air, and the low murmur of wind outside made it feel like I had stepped into another world entirely. I tossed my bag onto the couch, then moved to the window, pulling back the curtains to take in the view. The forest stretched endlessly into the distance, the trees swaying in the wind, their tops lost in the shadows of the night sky. There was something unsettling about it. The way the woods seemed to close in around the cabin, like the earth itself was trying to keep me from leaving. I shook off the sensation, telling myself I needed rest. The room was quiet, too quiet, almost. I turned on the radio for some background noise, but it only emitted static, the occasional crackle that only heightened the eerie atmosphere. I didn't bother with it, instead opting to light a fire in the fireplace to warm the space. As the fire crackled to life, I settled into a chair by the hearth. The shadows flickered on the walls, stretching and contorting in ways that felt almost deliberate. But I was tired. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the warmth of the fire soothe me. It wasn't long before I heard it, a soft scratching sound from somewhere in the walls. At first, I thought it might be an animal, mice or squirrels in the rafters. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate scrape, like fingernails against wood. I sat up straight, my heart beating faster. The fire crackled, casting brief flashes of light across the room, but there was nothing in the shadows. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the unease had already planted itself deep inside me. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. Nothing, just the dark outline of trees against the inky sky. I went back to the chair, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But every creak of the wood beneath my feet, every rustle of the trees outside, only made me more aware of the silence. The walls seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. It was as though the very space around me was alive, breathing in time with my own shallow breaths. I forced myself to ignore the sensation, grabbing a book from my bag to distract myself. The pages felt thick under my fingers, and the words blurred together as I tried to focus, but I couldn't. Every time I turned a page, I swore I saw something move in the corner of my vision, shadows darting, flickers of motion, like something or someone was just out of sight. It was then that I heard it again, a soft thump, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor above me. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one else here. The cabin was supposed to be empty. My gaze snapped to the stairs that led up to the second floor. I slowly stood up, my pulse quickening, and tiptoed to the bottom of the stairs. The air felt colder now, the temperature dropping without warning. My breath misted in the air. Another thump, and then a dragging sound again. But this time, it was closer. It was coming from the room above the stairs. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor. The air grew thick with tension, and then silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I gathered the courage to take the first step onto the creaky stairs. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and I winced at every groan of the wood beneath my weight. The sound above me stopped completely, leaving nothing but the sound of my own breath. When I reached the top, I turned down the hallway toward the room. The door was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling from within. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. There was nothing there. The room was empty. A small bed, a dresser, a window with heavy curtains drawn shut. But then I noticed something. On the floor beside the bed, a dark smudge, as though something had been dragged across the carpet. I kneeled down, examining the stain more closely. It was wet, sticky, darker than it should have been. Blood? But how? My mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. This couldn't be real. I had to be imagining things. And then I heard it, the softest whisper, like a voice calling my name from the darkness. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but no one was there. The room was empty, silent, save for the low, almost imperceptible creaking of the floorboards. I backed away from the bed, my pulse racing, my head spinning with thoughts of escape. I needed to leave, but as I turned to the door, something caught my eye. In the reflection of the window, I saw it, a figure, standing just behind me, obscured in shadow. I whirled around, but the room was still empty. My heart hammered in my chest. The air felt thick, stifling, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I staggered back into the hallway, my head spinning, and reached for the banister to steady myself. But as my hand gripped the wood, I felt a cold, clammy pressure, as though something unseen was holding me back. The whispers began again, soft, insistent, and this time, they were clear. "Leave now!" I yanked my hand away from the banister, stumbling backward down the stairs. The house seemed to grow taller, the shadows deeper, as though the very building was alive and trying to swallow me whole. The front door was just ahead. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and in that moment, I heard the most chilling sound yet, a laugh. It wasn't human, but it echoed through the walls like something ancient, something malevolent. I threw open the door and bolted outside, not stopping until I reached my car, fumbling to unlock it with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and as I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, standing silent in the distance. But in the reflection, I saw it again, the shadowy figure, standing at the window, watching me leave. And then, just before I turned the corner, I saw the door slowly creak shut behind it, as though it were bidding me goodbye. I've always been one to seek adventure. My friends would joke about my endless need for new experiences, and when I decided to take a solo trip into the heart of nowhere, they tried to talk me out of it. They thought it was reckless, but I thought it was exactly what I needed. Away from city noise, away from people, away from the chaos that had slowly started to consume my life. So, I rented a small cabin in a remote, almost forgotten corner of the world. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you had a map and a clear sense of direction. The kind of place where silence hung thick in the air like a weight, and the land seemed almost too quiet. The nearest town was a good 2 hours away, a tiny on the map that barely seemed to exist. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as I drove down the long, winding road that led to the cabin. The trees stood like silent sentinels on either side, their branches twisted in unnatural ways, their bark twisted and gnarled like hands reaching out to grab me. The further I drove, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on my chest. Finally, I pulled up to the cabin. It was a small, old structure made of weathered wood, looking like something straight out of a ghost story. The roof was covered in a patchwork of moss and lichen, and the windows were dark, unnervingly so. There was no sign of life around, no cars parked in the driveway, no lights flickering from inside, just the oppressive silence. As I stepped out of my car, I felt the stillness seep into my skin. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, fresh and untainted, yet something in the scent felt off. There was a strange sharpness to it, like the woods themselves were hiding something. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the door, my boots crunching the gravel beneath me. The door creaked as I opened it, and the sound echoed louder than I expected. Inside, it was cold, much colder than it should have been for the time of year. The place was sparsely furnished, a worn-out couch, a small dining table, an old stove. Nothing fancy, nothing to distract from the heavy silence that filled the air. I didn't think much of it at the time. I unpacked my things, settled in, and started a fire in the hearth. The warmth slowly spread through the room, pushing back against the cold that clung to the corners. As the fire crackled, I found myself relaxing, the tension in my shoulders easing. I was alone, yes, but it felt like the kind of solitude I had been craving for months. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's old windows. I lay in bed, listening to the creaks of the house settling, the occasional groan of the beams and floorboards. It was a comforting noise in a way, like the cabin itself was alive, breathing with me. But as the night deepened, something began to shift. I woke suddenly, my body frozen in place, eyes wide open. The air had grown colder again, even with the fire still burning. I could feel it now, a strange presence in the room with me. Something just beyond my reach, something that didn't belong. My eyes darted around the dark room, scanning for anything out of place. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The firelight flickered, casting long, twisting shapes across the walls. But it was more than that. There was a feeling in the air, something oppressive, something that made my chest tighten. Then, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. It was barely audible, but it was there, insistent, like something trying to get in. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the scratching grew louder, closer. It was coming from the floor, beneath the bed. I sat up in a panic, my heart racing as I swung my feet to the floor. The cabin was silent again, too silent. But the scratching continued, now unmistakable, right underneath me. I stood up and backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the deepening darkness, the firelight casting long shadows that seemed to move in strange, unnatural ways. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and shone it around the room. It flickered briefly, casting a strange, wavering light across the space. But when it landed on the floor, I froze. There was a thin, dark line running across the wooden floorboards, like something had dragged itself across the floor. It wasn't there when I went to bed. I felt my throat tighten, fear curling in my stomach as I crouched down to get a closer look. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam trembling as it illuminated the floor. And then I saw it, a faint, blackened handprint smeared across the wood, as though something had reached up from beneath the floor. I gasped and stumbled back, nearly tripping over the bed as I scrambled toward the door. My pulse raced as I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. Panic surged through me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. The scratching, the handprint, the way the shadows seemed to move. It was all too much. I ran to the window and threw it open, hoping to escape, but the wind howled louder outside, and the cold air bit into my skin. I could barely see the trees through the darkness, the moon barely visible behind the thick clouds. I turned back to the cabin, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the threshold of the door, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs and a pale, ghostly face that seemed to stretch in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were wide and hollow, like dark pits in its face. Its mouth stretched open in a grin that seemed to go on forever, exposing rows of jagged teeth. I froze, unable to move. It was as if the very air had been sucked from my lungs, the room closing in around me. My mind screamed for me to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure, and as I stared, I saw something shift behind it. More shapes, more figures, moving just out of the corner of my vision. The scratching noise came again, louder now, rising from the floor beneath my feet. It was as if the very foundation of the cabin was alive, crawling with something dark and hungry. The figure stepped forward, its long fingers reaching toward me. The shadows around it seemed to swallow the light, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. It moved like liquid, like it wasn't even bound by the laws of reality. I stumbled backward, finally managing to break free of my paralysis, but the door still wouldn't open. The figure's grin widened, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, and I could hear the faintest whisper in the air. "Stay with us." The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows around me seemed to press in tighter, suffocating me. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I slammed myself against the door, pushing with all my strength. And then it gave way. I tumbled out into the night, gasping for air as I ran toward my car. The figure was still standing in the doorway, its eyes fixed on me, its smile never fading. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I barely remembered the drive back, my mind consumed by what I had seen, what I had almost become a part of. To this day, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me back from that place. The strange noises, the shadows that never seemed to leave me. I've heard whispers in the dark, and sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I swear I can see those same hollow eyes watching me. I don't think I'll ever be free of the echo of that place. The darkness in the woods, the creatures in the shadows, they're still there, and they're still waiting. And if I listen closely enough, I can almost hear the scratching, growing louder again. I had never been one to fear the wilderness. As a child, I often sought refuge in the deep woods behind our house, comforted by the dense trees and the thick silence that only seemed to amplify the weight of my thoughts. But as an adult, the idea of isolation had become more unsettling than it had once been. That's why, when I was offered the assignment to research the history of an old, abandoned cemetery in the middle of nowhere, I felt both a sense of purpose and a gnawing dread. Something about this place, an ancient burial ground known simply as the Unmarked Graves, seemed to call to me, though I couldn't explain why. The drive to the site was long and uneventful, stretching over dusty backroads that wound deeper into the wilderness with each mile. The town maps I had found were old, and none of the locals seemed to know much about the cemetery anymore. The most I could gather was that it was a place forgotten by time, its tombstones long since weathered into indistinguishable slabs of stone. Still, curiosity had pulled me forward. I wanted to uncover its history, document the secrets it might hold. When I finally arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the forest that surrounded the cemetery. The air had taken on an almost tangible chill, though the season was far from autumn. The only sign that I had arrived at my destination was the rusted metal gate, barely visible under a tangle of ivy and overgrown brush. I parked my car just outside, grabbing my notebook, camera, and a flashlight before stepping out into the quiet. The first thing that struck me was the silence. It wasn't the usual stillness of a place untouched by human life. It was an oppressive silence, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pushed open the creaking gate and stepped onto the narrow, uneven path that led into the cemetery. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the earth clearly disturbed by years of neglect. Old, crooked trees loomed overhead, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The headstones, where they still existed, were obscured by thick moss and tangled vines. The further I ventured, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. At first, I told myself it was simply my imagination, but then I heard it, soft, like a breath, a whisper on the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear. But the wind had shifted, and all I could hear was the rustling of leaves. I took another step forward, trying to push the unease from my mind. I had a job to do, after all, but the closer I got to the center of the cemetery, the stranger the place seemed. It was as if the very ground beneath me was wrong, uneven, like the earth had settled strangely, as if something was buried there that was not meant to be. The cemetery was mostly abandoned, save for a few scattered remnants of graves that seemed almost intentionally hidden by nature. It was as though no one had tended to this place in generations. And yet, as I set up my camera to take some initial photos, I felt an unsettling shift in the atmosphere, like a crackling tension just out of sight. I tried to focus on my task, snapping photographs of the surrounding area. A faint movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing, only the gnarled trees swaying gently in the breeze. Still, something had moved, or rather, something had been there. I swallowed, trying to force the discomfort down. It's just my mind playing tricks, I thought. The shadows were stretching longer now, and the low hum of insects was the only sound breaking the eerie quiet. The stillness was unnatural, and as I walked deeper into the cemetery, I began to feel the weight of it, like the earth itself was pressing against me, urging me to leave. I found a small clearing near the center, a patch of ground where the weeds and ivy had been cleared away, revealing a circle of weathered stone slabs. Each stone was unmarked, their surfaces worn and pitted by years of exposure to the elements. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the graves, which had been overrun with plant life. These stones seemed different. Something about them drew me in, like an invisible force. I knelt beside the first one, brushing away the debris to get a clearer look. There was nothing, no inscription, no symbol, just an empty, blank surface. I reached for my camera to take a picture but froze mid-motion as a distant sound cut through the air. Soft, almost melodic, like a low chant. I quickly scanned the clearing, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere, carried on the wind, yet there was no one here. No movement, no life. My pulse quickened. It wasn't the wind. This wasn't the sound of nature. It was a voice. My flashlight flickered, and I jumped, almost dropping it. The beam shifted across the stones, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow, something impossibly tall, looming behind the stone circle. I turned, but the shadows were only shadows, stretching and shifting as the light flickered. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen, grew stronger. I was no longer alone. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. But something kept me rooted to the spot. It wasn't fear that paralyzed me. It was something deeper, a sense of inevitability, as though I had been led here for a reason. The wind picked up, rattling the branches above me, and the chanting grew louder, rising in volume as if responding to my unease. It wasn't until I turned to leave, feeling a sudden compulsion to escape, that the ground beneath me seemed to shift. My foot slipped, and I stumbled to the earth. The ground was uneven, far more so than I had realized, and I fell hard against the cold stone. A flash of something dark, moved past the corner of my eye. It was quick, too quick to identify, but it was there. A figure, like a wisp of shadow, hovering in the periphery of my vision. I scrambled to my feet, hands shaking, and in a panic, I looked around the clearing. The chanting, now distorted, seemed to grow more intense, echoing through the trees, but no one was there. Then I saw it. Beneath the stones, the earth was moving. Something was shifting, undulating as if something was trying to push its way to the surface. The ground near the stone circle cracked open, revealing a dark, narrow hole. And then I saw the hands. Pale, claw-like hands reached out from the hole, gripping the earth, pulling something from below. A face, twisted, hollow-eyed, and gaunt, emerged from the earth, gasping for air. It was a corpse. No, not just one corpse. There were more. A whole army of them, all crawling from the ground like they had been buried alive. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. The wind howled through the trees, but I could barely hear it over the sounds of the dead. They were coming. I turned and ran, pushing through the underbrush, not daring to look back. My breath was ragged, my mind consumed with the image of those pale hands clawing their way out of the earth. I couldn't outrun them. They were everywhere. Finally, I burst through the trees, and there, ahead of me, I saw my car. My one chance at escape. I ran, lungs burning, and just as I reached the vehicle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. Slamming the door behind me, I started the engine, tires screeching as I drove away from that cursed place. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw them. Those dark shapes, chasing after me, just beyond the glow of my headlights. They weren't dead. They were something worse, something older, and they were following me.